Tucket's home, Chapter 10. Francis could not believe the river. He stood with Lottie at his right and Billy at his left, Orson and the men off to the side, and stared at the river in awe, and not a little fear. It was half a mile across, smooth but with a fast current that made the dark waters royal so they looked almost alive and evil. The Columbia. They had come across the last of the high desert plains with little further mishap and no injuries. Now, following a trail that was so heavily traveled, it would have been impossible to get lost. They set the wagon wheels in the ruts. Game became more and more scarce, and Billy and Francis ranged farther and farther afield to get meat, at times going 10 or 15 miles off the track before they could find deer or elk. Buffalo had disappeared completely, hunted out in the years the wagons had been passing, as had most other game. But as they came near the river, they met Indians or different bands and tribes who wanted to barter tools or steel or guns for food. The men and Francis had nothing extra to trade, but Francis, who knew the more or less universal sign language used by all the tribes to trade or talk war or peace, took some young men aside and they showed him how to catch salmon in the river using line and bone hooks. Francis set to fishing as soon as they reached the river. The salmon were so numerous that they seemed to fill the water, and soon he had more than enough fish for everybody. The meat was oily and thick and rich, and while it tasted fine at first, within 2 days, Francis was ready for elk or venison again. Work on rafts began at once. The wagons were broken down and taken apart. Huge cedar logs were cut from the surrounding forest, and horses and harnesses were used to skid them down to the water. They lashed the logs together with rope and bark twine and used boards from the wagons to make flooring. Then they built a pen to hold the animals. But now the Indians, at first helpful, had changed. When it became apparent that the white men had nothing further to trade or sell, the Indians took to stealing. Any tool left lying around, a nail, a piece of rope, an auger bit, was soon gone. They hung around the camp constantly, watching the men work and waiting for a chance to grab something and run. The white men soon learned to keep track of their tools and equipment and stopped losing gear, but they began to distrust the Indians. While fishing one day, Francis befriended a young man named Ikta. Ikta's language was almost impossible for Francis to learn because there were so many short, guttural, sharply cut off phrases that were hard to pronounce. But they soon became almost fluid in their sign language, and Francis learned to trust Ikta. They were sitting on the bank one day, just after Francis had set his lines, watching the dark water stream past, when Ikta pointed down the river and signed, "The water down there is not safe." Francis sighed. "Why?" He watched Ikta carefully as he answered. It had been a dry year, no rain, very little snow. The river will not come high as it does sometimes. It is too low. There are places where many rocks stick out of the water like sharp teeth. They will eat the boats and the men and the horses and oxen. Is this all true? Yes. What must be done? There's a trail back through the mountains. It will take more time, but it is safe. My people could help you carry your goods and drive your animals. Do not let the men go on the river. That night while eating salmon, always salmon, Francis told Orson what Ikta had said. "We have not heard this before," Orson said. "Nobody in any group has left word. He says we are the first this year to try the river." Orson shook his head. "We would have heard. And now this man says his people will help us carry our things over the mountains? The same people who try to steal us blind?" "He says the river is too dangerous," Francis repeated. "Farther down, miles down into canyons, where you cannot turn around. He says there are rocks that will tear the rafts to pieces. You cannot get through." Orson sighed. He was not tired. Francis did not think he could ever be tired, but there was a sadness in his voice. "I think that we cannot believe what you have heard about the river. I think they merely want to steal more from us and are using this as a way to get what they want." "Orson, I believe him. I am going to go around." Orson shook his head. "You have learned how to make your own way, and you must do what you think is right. We wish you well." Francis knelt in the dirt and took a stick to sketch a map, and he thought of Grimes as he drew. How many times the mountain man had done the same thing, showing a tree, a river, mountains, drawn in the dirt as Francis did it now. "Here we are," he said. "Ikta said it would take 7 days by horse to get back to the river below the bad places. Lottie, Billy, and I will leave tomorrow with horses, and you won't be leaving for another week at least. We'll stop here, near where Ikta says there are 2 peaks, and camp by the river and wait. If you're right, when you come along, we'll rejoin you." And if we're wrong? Orson looked steadily at Francis. Francis shook his head. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. They shook hands, and Francis went to tell Lottie and Billy to get ready. That night they packed and arranged the loads. They left at dawn, and Francis did not look at the river as they rowed away. He thought only of shaking hands with Orson.